Some people did something. Those 4 words were the ones Ilhan Omar chose to describe the morning of the 11th of September, 2001, when nearly 3,000 Americans left their homes, boarded planes, walked into offices, kissed their spouses goodbye, and promised their children they would be home for dinner, only to disappear into fire, smoke, twisted steel, collapsing concrete, and the unanswered phone calls that their families would carry for the rest of their lives. The woman who reduced that national wound to 4 casual words later walked into another hearing room prepared not to explain the contradiction, not to confront the weight of what she had said, but to wrap herself in the familiar armor she raises whenever accountability draws too near: identity, victimhood, accusation, and the claim that every difficult question is merely another political attack disguised as oversight. Most congressional hearings are sterile performances in which politicians read statements written by staff, ask questions whose answers have already been rehearsed, interrupt one another for television clips, and leave the building having proved nothing except that Washington can consume several hours without producing a single honest moment. This hearing changed the moment Senator John Kennedy reached inside his jacket. He did not arrive with a cart of binders, a screen full of edited clips, or a theatrical stack of documents designed to impress the cameras. He carried one folded sheet of paper, 5 quotations written in his own hand, and the patience to let Omar's record expose itself without unnecessary decoration. Omar recognized danger before Kennedy had even adjusted his microphone, which is why she moved first. She declared that she understood exactly what the hearing represented, calling it another Republican show trial aimed at the only black Muslim woman in Congress, and invoking threats, harassment, and the chemical attack at her town hall before anyone had asked her a single question. That opening was not spontaneous outrage. It was the same defensive sequence the public had watched for years. A carefully conditioned response in which the accusation arrives before the evidence, the shield rises before the question, and scrutiny is redefined as prejudice so that the person being examined never has to remain on the substance long enough for the contradiction to become visible. Kennedy allowed every word to finish. He offered no interruption, displayed no irritation, and refused the usual senatorial habit of shuffling papers or sighing theatrically, because he understood that Omar's speech was not an obstacle to his argument, but the first piece of it, another demonstration of how quickly she uses language to control the terms of the room. When she finally stopped, Kennedy answered in the plain, almost rural cadence that has caused more than one polished Washington operator to mistake patience for simplicity. He explained that this was not a show trial and joked that in Louisiana, anyone looking for a show could visit the state fair and watch somebody guess their weight. The line drew a small reaction, but Kennedy did not linger on it because comedy was not the weapon in his pocket. The weapon was precision. Behind the country lawyer manner stood a Vanderbilt graduate, a top student from the University of Virginia School of Law, an Oxford-educated politician who understood exactly where every question was going. He unfolded the page, announced that he had written down 5 of Omar's public statements himself to ensure accuracy, and began with the phrase that had followed her since 2019, reading "some people did something" slowly enough that each word was forced to stand alone beside the scale of the dead. Kennedy asked what Omar meant by "some people." Omar responded with the answer she had practiced for years, explaining that the full speech concerned the discrimination Muslim Americans experienced after September 11 and accusing Republicans of extracting 3 words from a 40-minute address to use as a political weapon. It was a polished defense, familiar, efficient, and built for a predictable opponent waving a cable news clip. But Kennedy was not challenging only the context of one sentence. He was examining the system behind her vocabulary, the moral formula determining which deaths receive soft language, which political enemies receive explosive language, and which inconvenient scandals receive no language at all. He agreed that context mattered, a move that immediately denied Omar the easy escape of claiming he refused to consider the surrounding speech. Then he explained that if the September 11 quotation had truly been distorted, her other statements should reveal a broader pattern of respect for victims and consistency in judgment. The second quotation came from February 2019, when Omar wrote, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," and answered AIPAC when asked who she believed was paying American politicians, language that members of her own party identified as an anti-Semitic trope and that eventually produced a public apology. Kennedy asked whether the apology had been sincere. Omar said it had, insisting that she learned from the episode, grew from it, and had always opposed anti-Semitism in every form. A carefully arranged answer containing exactly the words expected from a politician who wanted the controversy closed without having the underlying pattern examined. Kennedy accepted the claim of growth without argument, then moved directly to what followed, because growth in Washington is frequently announced at a microphone while behavior continues unchanged after the cameras leave, and the only serious way to measure an apology is to compare it with the decisions made once public pressure has faded. He turned to the Iron Dome vote, explaining that the system was defensive rather than offensive, a mechanism designed to intercept rockets before they struck schools, apartment buildings, and families gathered around dinner tables. He emphasized the overwhelming House vote of 420 to 9 and Omar's position among the 9 members who opposed the funding. Omar framed that decision as a legitimate policy objection to unconditional military assistance, declared that questioning blank check aid was her right as a member of Congress, and refused to apologize for exercising that authority. But Kennedy never disputed her legal right to cast the vote because legality was not the contradiction he was exposing. His question was narrower and far more damaging. How could Omar present herself as transformed by the 2019 controversy, assure the country that she understood why her language had been offensive, and then 17 months later oppose funding for a system whose central purpose was stopping rockets before they killed civilians, including children? The hearing had not yet reached its sharpest comparison, but Kennedy had already constructed the first section of the map, context that seemed to change according to political need, an apology whose meaning weakened under later conduct, and a declaration of growth that looked convincing only until someone calmly placed the words beside the record. Kennedy looked back down at the page and moved to the third quotation, the moment when the structure he had been building stopped looking like a collection of unrelated controversies and began to resemble a kinagan, one in which the intensity of Omar's language rose or fell, not according to the number of lives lost, the innocence of the victims, or the facts of the event, but according to whether the target belonged to her political side. He cited the 24th of February 2026 State of the Union address when Omar shouted that the president was a murderer, a liar, and a man who had killed Americans, language delivered on the floor of Congress, with every major camera in the country recording it and millions of citizens watching from home. Kennedy acknowledged the deaths of 2 Americans during an ICE operation in Omar's district and called those deaths a tragedy, refusing to cheapen the loss or pretend that the lives did not matter. But then he placed those 2 deaths beside the nearly 3,000 people killed on September 11 and forced the comparison Omar had avoided for years. 3,000 dead Americans had received "some people did something," while 2 deaths connected to a president Omar despised produced the word murderer repeated publicly, angrily, and without the careful qualifications she demanded whenever her own language came under examination. Kennedy's question was devastating because it required no ideological lecture, no partisan editorial, and no complicated historical argument. It required only arithmetic, memory, and the willingness to admit that the vocabulary did not match the scale of the events. Omar's defenders could debate immigration policy, law enforcement conduct, military aid, or the treatment of Muslim Americans for hours, but none of those arguments changed the blunt imbalance Kennedy placed on the table, because the issue was no longer whether Omar had the right to be angry, but whether her anger followed any recognizable standard beyond political loyalty. Every American old enough to remember September 11 remembers where they were, what they saw, the endless smoke pouring from lower Manhattan, the desperate calls that never reached their intended recipients, and the unbearable knowledge that thousands of ordinary people had gone to work that morning and would never walk through their front doors again. Yet Omar's language for that mass murder had been abstract, distant, and strangely bloodless, while her language for two deaths connected to a president she opposed became immediate, personal, and morally absolute, as though outrage only became fully available when it could be directed at the correct enemy. Kennedy did not need to accuse her of selective compassion, because the words did the work for him. Once the comparison was spoken aloud, the pattern that many Americans had sensed for years could no longer be dismissed as partisan resentment or emotional overreaction. The problem was not that Omar used strong words. The problem was that she seemed to reserve her strongest words for political opponents while softening, redirecting, or withholding judgment when the facts threatened the narrative she preferred. Omar understood that the ground beneath her had shifted. Instead of answering the comparison directly, she attacked the legitimacy of the hearing, accusing Kennedy and Republicans of weaponizing grief, turning tragedy into political theater, and using death to intimidate a black Muslim woman who refused to remain silent in Congress. The accusation was calculated because it changed the subject from the inconsistency in her own words to the motives of the man reading them. And for a brief moment, it created uncertainty in the room, since politicians from both parties have unquestionably exploited grief when doing so benefited their cause. Kennedy did not deny the possibility, lash out, or respond with a defensive speech about his own intentions. He sat silently for several seconds, accepted that politicians sometimes weaponize tragedy, and even admitted that he might have done so himself without realizing it. That concession stripped Omar's accusation of much of its force because she had prepared to fight denial, indignation, and counterattack, not a man willing to acknowledge human imperfection before returning calmly to the evidence. Kennedy then shifted away from abstract grief and toward a specific death, explaining that he wanted to discuss a man who had been alive one evening and dead the next morning, and the words Omar chose while that man's family was still absorbing the shock. He raised the killing of Charlie Kirk on the 10th of September 2025, noting that Kirk was 31 years old, married, the father of two small children, and shot on the campus of Utah Valley University. He emphasized that Omar appeared on a podcast only 14 hours after the murder. Kennedy refused to repeat every statement she made in that appearance because Kirk's family might be watching, but he described the timing and the substance clearly enough. While the body had not yet been buried and the family had barely begun to process what happened, Omar was already using the moment to condemn the rhetoric associated with the victim. 2 days later, she reposted a video to millions of followers that described Kirk as Dr. Frankenstein and said that his monster had shot him through the neck, converting the murder of a young father into a political metaphor before his wife and children had been given even the smallest distance from the violence. Omar defended herself by saying she was criticizing dangerous rhetoric, pointing to the threats and violence she had personally experienced, and arguing that she understood better than most how incendiary words could lead to real attacks. Kennedy accepted that the threats against her were real, expressed sympathy for them, and then returned to the point she could not escape. She had countless opportunities to condemn political violence without qualification, but 14 hours after a man was murdered, she chose instead to explain why his own rhetoric supposedly helped create the conditions for his death. That distinction mattered because Omar was not speaking months later in an academic debate about polarization, nor was she examining a long historical record after emotions had cooled. She was commenting while Kirk's wife was still at the hospital, his children were still without their father, and the country had barely processed the fact that a political figure had been shot through the neck on a college campus. Kennedy observed that every public figure says things they later regret, and he included himself in that admission. But he drew a hard line between ordinary verbal mistakes and the decision to treat a murdered man as morally responsible for his own killing before the family had even reached the first night without him. The contrast with Omar's State of the Union outburst was now impossible to ignore. The president received the word murderer for deaths connected to a law enforcement operation, while a man who was actually murdered received language suggesting that the consequences had been produced by his own conduct. Again, Kennedy did not need to announce the conclusion with a dramatic flourish because the sequence was already clear, written in Omar's own public record, and organized with enough patience that even the most determined defender could see the imbalance. 3,000 deaths became vague phrasing. A murdered political opponent became a Frankenstein comparison, and 2 deaths that could be placed at the feet of a hated president became grounds for a televised accusation of murder. By this point, the page in Kennedy's hand had become more than a list of quotations. It had become a record of how Omar assigned moral weight, how she intensified language when attacking enemies, softened it when discussing national trauma, and redirected accountability whenever her preferred political narrative was threatened. The issue was not merely hypocrisy in the shallow Washington sense, where one politician says one thing and later does another, but a deeper pattern in which sympathy, condemnation, and outrage appear to operate according to faction rather than principle. Kennedy had shown that Omar could speak with maximum certainty when accusing the president, with chilling speed when discussing the death of Charlie Kirk, and with remarkable distance when recalling September 11. Yet he had not reached the most damaging silence on the page. The next subject would not involve a controversial phrase, a foreign policy vote, or an emotional outburst during a presidential address. It would involve $250 million taken from a program intended to feed hungry children in Omar's own district. And unlike the earlier examples, this contradiction would not be found in something Omar said, but in the words she never seemed willing to say when the scandal was closest to home. Kennedy picked up the folded page again, but this time he was no longer reading a quotation because the next contradiction was not hidden inside something Omar had said. It was buried inside the silence she maintained while one of the largest pandemic fraud schemes in the country spread through the community she claimed to defend. He turned to Feeding Our Future, a federal nutrition program created to provide meals for low-income children during the pandemic, children whose schools had closed, whose families were struggling, and whose need was real, even while opportunists were constructing fake meal sites and submitting fraudulent claims for food that was never prepared. The number was not small enough to dismiss as paperwork error, bureaucratic confusion, or ordinary government waste. Approximately $250 million had been stolen from a program built around hungry children, with money flowing through false invoices, fabricated attendance records, shell organizations, and meal counts that existed primarily on paper. Kennedy stripped away every soft bureaucratic phrase that Washington normally uses to make corruption sound accidental, emphasizing that the money had not merely been misspent, misplaced, or poorly supervised, but stolen by people who understood exactly what they were doing and believed the system was too weak to stop them. The state had only 2 employees responsible for monitoring fraud across the program, 2 people guarding a pipeline carrying hundreds of millions of federal dollars, and the predictable result was a feeding frenzy conducted beneath the banner of feeding children. Federal prosecutors charged roughly 60 people, many connected to Omar's district, while the alleged architect of the network, Amy Bach, later received a 41-year federal sentence. Numbers so severe that any member of Congress genuinely outraged by exploitation should have been capable of producing at least one unmistakable public condemnation. Kennedy acknowledged that Bach had told investigators Omar knew about the activity and that Omar's office denied the allegation, but he did not attempt to prove personal knowledge during the hearing because he did not need an unresolved accusation to expose what was already visible in her public record. His question was simpler, cleaner, and far more difficult to evade. What word had Omar used for the people who stole food money from children in the district she represented and repeatedly invoked whenever she needed moral authority? Kennedy explained that he had searched her press releases, social media posts, interviews, statements, and public appearances, yet he could not find a single occasion when she called anyone connected to the scandal a thief. The president received murderer in front of the nation. Charlie Kirk received a savage metaphor while his family was still in shock. September 11 received a phrase drained of scale, but those accused of stealing $250 million from hungry children received caution, distance, and silence. That silence was not neutral, and Kennedy treated it as evidence because public officials reveal priorities not only through the words they choose, but also through the scandals they decline to name when forceful language would threaten allies, donors, community relationships, or political narratives. Omar had opened the hearing by declaring that she cared about her community and would not allow anyone to silence her. Yet when the children in that community became the victims of an organized theft operation, her voice suddenly lost the sharpness it displayed against national political opponents. There was no shortage of rhetorical ammunition available to her, no legal barrier preventing condemnation, and no confusion about whether stealing money intended for meals was wrong. Yet the politician famous for moral certainty became noticeably restrained when the crime was local, embarrassing, and politically inconvenient. Kennedy did not accuse every resident of the district, did not smear an ethnic community, and did not pretend that Omar was personally responsible for every fraudulent claim, but he refused to accept the absurd standard that a representative can claim unlimited moral ownership of a community's suffering while claiming no obligation to confront corruption operating inside it. If Omar's words carried moral meaning when directed at presidents, governments, police, and political adversaries, then their absence carried meaning when millions vanished from a program designed to place food in front of children. Kennedy then moved from the stolen federal money to Omar's household finances, not by declaring guilt, not by pretending an investigation was a conviction, but by placing another set of numbers beside the silence already sitting in the room. When Omar entered Congress in 2019, her financial disclosure showed relatively modest assets consistent with a career in community organizing and nonprofit work, a background she frequently used to present herself as a representative of ordinary people standing against entrenched wealth and political privilege. Her later disclosures, however, placed the value of companies associated with her husband at close to $10 million, including a California winery and a venture capital firm, while the Department of Justice had opened an investigation involving her finances and campaign spending. Kennedy stated clearly that he would not question her about the investigation itself, because that matter belonged to federal investigators and because unresolved allegations did not need to be exaggerated when the disclosed change in financial position already raised an obvious public question. His purpose was not to deliver a criminal verdict from a committee chair, but to force Omar to explain how a politician so eager to assign moral blame everywhere else could remain verbally restrained while money disappeared from children's programs and extraordinary new value appeared inside her own household. The comparison was brutal because it placed Omar's political language beside the material realities closest to her power. And suddenly, the grand speeches about justice, oppression, accountability, and defending the vulnerable looked less like universal principles and more like weapons deployed selectively against distant enemies. She had immediate words for a president, immediate words for Israel, immediate words for America, immediate words for Republicans, and immediate words for a murdered conservative. But when prosecutors described a massive fraud scheme centered in her district, the vocabulary of outrage seemed to evaporate. Kennedy did not claim that the fraud money flowed into her family's businesses, and he did not need to invent that connection, because the sharper point was the obvious disparity between her appetite for accusation and her caution when scrutiny approached her own political environment. $250 million had been stolen. Dozens of defendants had been charged. A program for hungry children had been turned into an organized cash machine. And the representative who entered the room insisting she could never be silenced had somehow failed to produce even the basic word thief. That was not proof of criminal conduct, but it was proof of political selectivity, the kind that becomes impossible to defend once someone removes the slogans, lines up the numbers, and asks why outrage disappears exactly where responsibility becomes uncomfortable. By then, Omar's opening claim that the hearing was merely another show trial had collapsed under the weight of her own public record because Kennedy had not introduced an elaborate conspiracy, relied on anonymous gossip, or demanded that anyone trust his interpretation without seeing the underlying pattern. He had used her quotations, her vote, her timing, her public reactions, her district's most notorious fraud scandal, and her own financial disclosures, arranging them in a sequence that exposed a politician whose moral intensity appeared to be governed less by principle than by political usefulness. The danger of Kennedy's method was its restraint because he did not shout over Omar, did not expand her statements into claims she had never made, and did not allow the hearing to become a debate over whether she had experienced racism, threats, or genuine danger. Those realities could be acknowledged without erasing the contradiction, and Kennedy's refusal to deny them made it harder for Omar to retreat behind the usual accusation that accountability itself was an act of prejudice. Every defense she had prepared depended on an opponent behaving recklessly, yet Kennedy kept conceding what was reasonable, isolating what was inconsistent, and returning to the arithmetic she could not explain. The hearing had now moved beyond whether one phrase about September 11 had been taken out of context, because the page showed a larger and uglier pattern stretching across death, policy, scandal, money, and the calculated use of moral language. Some people did something was no longer standing alone. It now sat beside murderer, beside the Frankenstein repost, beside the silence over stolen meal money, and beside a household portfolio that had grown dramatically while Omar's district became synonymous with pandemic fraud. None of those facts automatically proved every accusation her critics had made, but together they destroyed the image of consistent moral judgment she had presented at the beginning of the hearing. Kennedy had demonstrated that Omar's language was not merely passionate, imperfect, or occasionally careless. It was distributed according to a political hierarchy in which enemies received certainty, allies received context, and inconvenient local corruption received caution. What remained was not another number, another scandal, or another public quote, but the final judgment Kennedy had been building toward from the moment he unfolded the paper. He folded the sheet once, the same way it had been folded inside his jacket, and looked at Omar not as though he were preparing another attack, but as though he had finished the evidence and was ready to explain what the evidence meant. Kennedy told her that she was one of the most talented speakers he had seen in government, a person with a genuine command of language, capable of making audiences rise, making supporters angry, and making people believe that someone had finally articulated what they had been thinking. It was not empty flattery. And that was precisely why it landed so hard, because Kennedy was acknowledging that Omar's words mattered before identifying the two words absent from 7 years of speeches, interviews, rallies, hearings, television appearances, and congressional statements. He began listing the language she had repeatedly used about America and its institutions, words such as murderer, racist, colonial, apartheid, and the unforgettable phrase that had reduced September 11 to "some people did something." Then he paused, because the next point did not require a louder voice, only the uncomfortable fact that a woman who possessed nearly every word needed to condemn the country had somehow failed to use the two simplest words associated with gratitude. Kennedy looked across the table and said that in 7 years of serving in the United States Congress, occupying a seat made possible by the country she had so often condemned, Ilhan Omar had used nearly every accusation available except the two words: ordinary parents teach their children before they are old enough to understand politics. America had taken her in as a 12-year-old refugee from Somalia, given her safety, citizenship, education, the freedom to speak without government punishment, and eventually a position inside the most powerful legislature in the world, yet gratitude remained strangely absent from the enormous vocabulary she carried into every public confrontation. She had found endless ways to describe America as racist, colonial, oppressive, murderous, corrupt, and morally bankrupt. But Kennedy said he could not find a single moment when she had stood before a microphone and simply said, "Thank you." The phrase was not complicated, ideological, partisan, or expensive. It required no legislation, no committee authorization, no campaign consultant, and no carefully drafted statement from communications staff. It required only recognition that something had been given. For the first time in the hearing, Omar faced a question that could not be escaped through context, identity, procedure, policy, or accusation. The room became completely still, not with the artificial silence that follows a chairman's request for order, but with the silence of people who had just watched 7 years of public language reduced to one glaring absence. Omar did not lean toward the microphone, interrupt Kennedy, accuse him of racism, declare that the hearing was Islamophobic, or revive the claim that Republicans were staging another political performance against a woman of color. She sat motionless because Kennedy had not demanded that she abandon her political beliefs, apologize for being Muslim, or praise every decision made by the American government. He had asked why someone given safety and power by the country had apparently never expressed gratitude toward it. That was the force of the moment, because saying thank you would not have erased America's flaws, excused discrimination, defended every war, or surrendered her right to criticize the nation's institutions. It would merely have acknowledged that the country she described almost entirely through accusation had also opened a door that allowed her to build the life and career from which those accusations were delivered. Kennedy folded the paper again, returning it to the same compact shape in which it had rested inside his jacket. And the gesture made clear that the questioning was finished because no additional binder, video clip, or dramatic declaration was necessary. 5 quotations, 1 record, several numbers, and 2 missing words had done more damage than an hour of partisan shouting could have accomplished, precisely because every piece of the argument had come from Omar's own statements, votes, reactions, and silences. Kennedy told her that he appreciated her time, said he believed they were finished, and ended with the very words he had accused her of withholding, "Thank you." The irony was controlled rather than theatrical, and that restraint made it sharper because Kennedy was not celebrating a victory or demanding applause. He was demonstrating the simple courtesy whose absence had become the final evidence against her. Omar remained silent, not because she had never survived a hostile hearing before, but because the sequence had left no convenient opening through which she could transform the record into another complaint about the people presenting it. She had lost arguments in the past and continued speaking, turned criticism into fundraising material, transformed condemnation into evidence of persecution, and converted political embarrassment into another reason for supporters to defend her more aggressively. This time, the usual escape routes were blocked because Kennedy had not accused her of secretly holding beliefs that could not be proved, had not invented dialogue, and had not relied on rumors that she could dismiss as right-wing fabrication. He had placed "some people did something" beside "murderer," placed the language surrounding Charlie Kirk beside the silence surrounding "feeding our future," and placed her household's dramatic financial rise beside the moral certainty she routinely directed at everyone else. The resulting picture did not depend on whether the audience loved Kennedy, hated Republicans, supported Israel, opposed immigration enforcement, or agreed with Omar's legislative agenda. It depended on whether words should have consistent moral weight, and her record suggested that their weight changed whenever the political identity of the victim, the accused, or the beneficiary changed. Every child learns please and thank you before learning the language of government, because those words express obligations more basic than ideology, the recognition that human beings do not create every opportunity alone, and that receiving something carries at least a minimal duty to acknowledge it. Parents teach gratitude for a birthday present, a glass of water, a meal at a neighbor's house, or a small kindness from a stranger, not because every gift is perfect, but because entitlement without acknowledgement turns generosity into something the recipient begins to believe was always owed. Kennedy's point was not that Omar needed to praise every chapter of American history or pretend that the nation had never failed its promises, because criticism and gratitude are not mutually exclusive unless a politician needs them to be. Millions of immigrants have criticized America while still acknowledging that its institutions gave them safety, work, education, freedom, and opportunities unavailable in the countries they left behind. Omar's public language appeared to contain the criticism in endless supply while treating gratitude as though it were a surrender to political enemies. That absence mattered because the American immigration story is not built on the claim that the country is flawless, but on the reality that people repeatedly cross oceans, borders, languages, and legal systems, because even an imperfect America offers possibilities that many other places systematically deny. People arrive with little money, unfamiliar customs, broken English, professional credentials that may not transfer, and families depending on them. Yet they work, study, pay taxes, start businesses, raise children, vote, and gradually construct lives that would once have seemed impossible. Many of them never received television interviews, campaign donations, congressional offices, security details, or millions of social media followers. But they still understand that gratitude does not erase struggle and criticism does not require contempt. They may thank the country privately in a kitchen, a church, a factory parking lot, or on a sidewalk before dawn without expecting applause or political reward. That quiet gratitude stands in brutal contrast to a member of Congress who received an extraordinary platform and seemed to use it primarily to explain why the nation that elevated her deserved condemnation. America allowed Omar to stand on the floor of Congress and call the president a murderer without disappearing into a prison cell, losing citizenship by decree, or being silenced by a government censor. And that freedom itself was part of what Kennedy was asking her to recognize. It allowed her to build a national following, attack powerful institutions, question military policy, denounce law enforcement, criticize Israel, accuse colleagues of prejudice, and return home each night, protected by the constitutional system she repeatedly described in its darkest possible terms. That does not mean threats against her were acceptable, discrimination against Muslim Americans was imaginary, or every criticism she offered was invalid. But none of those realities answered why appreciation for the opportunities she personally received was missing from the record. A country can be flawed and still deserve gratitude for what it provides, just as a family, community, or institution can fail in some ways without every benefit it gives becoming meaningless. Kennedy understood that distinction, and Omar's silence suggested that she either did not understand it or believed admitting it would weaken the political identity she had spent years constructing. The senator's method worked because he did not demand patriotism through force, perform outrage for cameras, or drown the hearing in slogans about flags, freedom, and national greatness. He simply arranged Omar's own language until the contradiction became visible, showing that the woman who claimed to speak fearlessly had been fearless mainly when the target was politically useful and remarkably cautious when accountability moved closer to her district allies, finances, or preferred causes. The hearing was not ultimately about whether Omar had the constitutional right to say everything she said, because that right was never seriously in question and was itself one of the gifts America had provided. It was about character, consistency, and whether a person entrusted with national power could recognize any obligation to the nation beyond the permanent right to accuse it. Kennedy's folded paper supplied the answer more clearly than another speech ever could. Somewhere in America, parents were still teaching children to say thank you for food, shelter, help, kindness, and opportunity, even when the gift was small and even when the giver was imperfect. Somewhere else, immigrants were beginning work before sunrise, studying English after exhausting shifts, helping children with homework in a language they were still learning themselves, and quietly appreciating a country that had given them room to try. Those people would never sit where Omar sat, never command her audience, never receive her salary, and never possess the authority to question cabinet officials or shape federal law. Yet many of them understood instinctively what she had failed to express publicly. Gratitude does not make a person weak, obedient, or politically harmless. It proves that criticism comes from someone capable of recognizing both what is broken and what has been given. Without that balance, moral judgment becomes entitlement dressed as courage. When Kennedy finally returned the paper to his jacket, the most powerful thing left in the room was not one of Omar's accusations, not the $250 million figure, not the contrast between 3,000 deaths and 2, and not even the political humiliation of her silence. It was the reminder that two ordinary words can expose more about a public figure than thousands of carefully prepared speeches, because gratitude reveals whether power has been received as a responsibility or absorbed as something naturally deserved. Omar had spent years demanding that America account for every failure, every injustice, every contradiction, and every injury. Yet Kennedy's final question turned that demand back toward her and asked what account she had ever given for everything the country had provided. She had no answer in the hearing room, and no amount of rhetoric could manufacture one after the record had been placed in order. One folded sheet of paper was enough, because when the words were finally arranged correctly, the silence said everything.